The Newsagents.
It's a new year, and it is almost certainly an election year. And yet, even though we are just 3 days in, suddenly, psychologically, it feels different. The fact that we are saying the election this year rather than next year has got everyone in Westminster chattering away with one question on their lips. When will it be?
And of course, for Rishi Sunak, the decision is his. But he's got to be very careful that he doesn't get boxed in by Labour saying there's going to be an early election. Because if he cancels it, it will look like he's running scared. So what's he going to do to keep his options open, but at the same time not allow himself to become a prisoner of the calendar? Welcome to the Newsagents. It's John.
It's Lewis.
And Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. It's like we've never been away.
We're back in our favourite little studio. No Emily for the moment. She'll be back at the beginning of next week.
Yes.
But we are going to crack on because what you just said is so right. It just feels like December the 30th, 2023, the election feels like a long way away. It's next year.
I know, it's amazing, isn't it?
And it's just immediately you come back and think, oh my God, this is election year.
Yeah.
When's it going to be? What's going to happen? Is everybody ready? What are the parties doing? And you're seeing it, or some of it already playing out today with, Reform coming out and doing their bit.
They're actually giving election manifesto pledges on the 3rd of January for an election that could be 12 months away.
And Reform are not going to win any seats, I would bet, at the next general election, but they are a wrecking ball in UK politics because they do have the ability to stop other people winning seats.
Yeah, and we should rewind a bit maybe, and just for people who might remember something called the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. There might be people who have tuned out over the last couple of years ever so slightly, not that anybody listening to this podcast ever tunes out of the news, but we had the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, which was brought in during the coalition years. And that was supposed to take this power that the Prime Minister has to choose the date of an election away. That, you would have parliaments that were 5 years, fixed, they would be every May, and everybody knew when they were going to be. In fact, that only really happened once during 2010 to 15. Then we had a series of early elections, and then during this Parliament, that legislation was repealed, and the power for the Prime Minister to call an election, which is technically a power of the sovereign, but which is in reality a power for the Prime Minister, was returned to him or to her. So it is in Rishi Sunak's gift, as you say, John, to decide when that election could be. Theoretically, it could be as late as the 28th of January next year. The PM appeared to rule that out in, of all places, the Downing Street lobby Christmas drinks in December. So it looks like it will definitely be this year. But as you say, there is now all this speculation about whether it's going to be May, whether it's going to be in the autumn, and all sorts of different calculations for Sunak as to what plays into all of that.
It's so funny. When I was in the States, and Americans would say, well, when's your next general election going to be? And I'd say, well,
don't know.
Don't know. They go, what? Because, in America, it's going to be the first Tuesday in November every 4 years.
Yep.
And in here, we have the discretion of the Prime Minister to decide when it will be in his or her and their party's best interests to go. But just going back to Reform a minute, because I went bowling into Reform and we didn't really explain who they were. I mean, Reform, of course, were formed out of UKIP, and it's Richard Tice's party. The big question is Nigel Farage going to join it, and is he going to be the person who upstages politics once again, and with his power to kind of have this effect on British politics? He can never win a seat, but he can actually alter outcomes. And what Reform was saying today, which I think is kind of interesting, is they say, we are not going to do any pre-election deals with the Conservatives. Now, if they're going to get 10% of the vote in mainly Conservative seats, that is very, very serious for the Conservative Party. And if there is no accommodation with Reform UK, that is another drag anchor on Rishi Sunak and his prospects of finding this incredibly narrow path towards victory.
Yeah, Richard Tice has made clear that he is not going to do what the precursor of the Reform Party, i.e. the Brexit Party, did under Farage in December 2019, which is agree to partially stand down in Conservative-held seats, only contest Labour seats. He said he's had the scars on his back from that. That's never ever going to happen again. So it does look like Reform is going to be more of a player. They are regularly polling at about 8 to 10%. Should be said, they haven't managed to translate that anywhere. Whenever there's been an electoral contest, whenever local elections and so on, they're still a relatively kind of small organisation. They haven't had that much money. Tice himself had to loan the party £1 million. He's now saying that the donations are coming in. But it's clear that they are going to be a player in the election, and that itself will factor into Sunak's calculations. I think they will have a very strong eye as to how well Reform do in the Wellingborough by-election, which of course we know is now going to be coming up. We don't know exactly the date, but it'll be over the next couple of months. UKIP, the sort of precursor to the precursor of Reform, came second there in the 2015 general election. So if they do well, then that is going to help them with donations, it's going to help them with momentum, it's going to help them with activists. They claim that they've got lots of Conservative members heading their way, so they're trying to pull off the trick that UKIP pulled from the years roughly from 2008-9 right up until 2016. The difference, of course, you've already alluded to it, John, is that they don't have Farage yet. And Farage, I mean, Tice is he was sort of Farage's deputy. He doesn't quite have the touch, the kind of sort of demotic elan that Farage had. And so, there's all this speculation. Will he come back in? Won't he? I kind of doubt that Farage is going to come back in a direct way to lead it or to stand, frankly, because he's having a nicer life than doing what he's doing at the moment, basically getting the Conservative Party to do almost whatever he wants, being on GB News and so on. But clearly, it is going to be a problem for Sunak, at least to some extent, and that itself, how well Reform are doing or otherwise, is going to form part of his calculation and thinking as to when the election is going to be.
Well, this was Richard Tice earlier today.
Now, let's be clear. The country never voted that it was ready for Rishi. But I am absolutely certain that the country is ready for Rishi to call an election sooner rather than later. Because I'm also certain, and in fact I'm cheerful, I'm optimistic, that the country quite rightly wants to punish the Tories for breaking Britain, because that is what they want to do. I think the country wants to punish them, to oust them and replace them.
So that was Richard Tice. But what does Rishi Sunak do? Because on the one hand, it is the natural thing, when you have got all the cards in your hand about when you're going to call the election, you keep all your options open. If you don't have to put down the card and say, it's November, it's January 25, it's May, you're going to keep people guessing. The danger of keeping people guessing, it seems to me, is that if you let it run, that there is a possibility of a May general election. If it doesn't happen, there's a danger you look like, well, you've run a mile. You're frit, to use the famous Maggie Thatcher word, and that you are scared of facing the people on polling day.
Completely. Look, if I were Sunak, I would do something bold and something that prime ministers don't usually do, which is I would announce this week when the election was going to be, and I would say that it was going to be in, say, November the 18th or the week after that. Because what they're doing at the moment is that they are creating a big problem for themselves. It is helpful in one sense to keep the prospect of a May election, and a hill that I'm willing to die on, by the way, is we shouldn't be calling this an early election. It wouldn't be an early election. It's like 4 years in. A May election, the prospect of dangling that over his MPs does create a certain sense of party discipline. And he will have one eye on the fact that his internal political position is potentially quite weak, and it could get weaker in the weeks and months ahead, particularly if they do badly in the by-elections in Wellingborough and in Blackpool, and then in the local elections in May. That said, that gain of keeping the election going as a means of basically scaring his MPs starts to be outweighed by the possibility of Labour constantly talking up a May election, which they have done and are going to continue to do over the next coming weeks. And then they turn around when, inevitably, Sunak gets to early March, which is when he would have to call the election, or just after early March, to have a dissolution of Parliament. They turn around to him and say, you've bottled it, which is exactly the strategy and exactly the playbook that Cameron used in 2007 against Gordon Brown, and he never, ever recovered. So Sunak, as ever, we've talked about it before, John, of this number 10 being all tactics and no strategy, and indeed sort of meandering from one strategy to the other. They've got to, I think, nip this in the bud, because it is going to be a dangerous thing if they allow it to build over the next couple of weeks.
Aren't there other good reasons why you talked about party discipline and keeping people focused and his internal position of the party? If you wait until November, there are going to be 1 million more people paying higher mortgages. The election will then come with a lot of new candidates after the local council elections, which could be brutal for the Conservative Party, where they're up for re-election in all these seats in England. and that actually then you lose the foot soldiers to help the prospective parliamentary candidate in the general election, and that you then are in a situation where you haven't got the foot soldiers to fight a November election. I mean, I know there are good arguments why you leave it longer, and also you set out your stall in a March budget, you promise the tax cuts, things are getting better, let's go for it.
Well, look, there's two scenarios that Downing Street will be mulling over. One is you go for a May election to obviate what you've just said, John, which is you think the local election is going to be bad. That's going to dent our momentum even more. There are going to be more people who have had to shift to higher mortgages by the end of the year. That's going to dent our core vote. Labour have got even more time to amass their formidable election machine. Our opponents can do that, and they can, we don't see the economic situation getting much rosier by the end of the year. Let's go early. Let's look decisive. Let's just see off all of that potential attack of dithering. That's scenario one. Scenario two, though, is that if we can play it long, at the very least, inflation will probably have come down even further by the end of the year. The Bank of England, if the economy is looking a bit ropey, may well, in fact, I think almost certainly will have reduced interest rates by the end of the year. And we will have at least managed to corral what our attack against Labour is and what we're trying to say about ourselves. I actually think to some extent all of this talk about when the election is going to be is a bit of a distraction. Yes, it might make some difference at the edges. Far more important, whenever the election comes, is that Sunak and the Conservatives have a message to sell about themselves and about their candidate, about their principle, about Sunak himself, and have something to say about Starmer and Labour. As we were talked about a lot towards the end of last year, the actual Conservative strategy and narrative about what they're saying about themselves and their opponents has been all over the place. So for me, the advantage, far better in terms of playing it long, is at the least then the Conservatives and Number 10 might have the ability to try and corral and create a strategy as to what they want to say to the country. And that's far more important, actually, than when the election is going to be, what they're trying to say.
But, I mean, one of the things that fascinated me over the Christmas period when you were up in the Nordics...
Sounds like a euphemism.
You were up the Nordics.
I was right up the Nordics.
You took me right up the Nordics.
Yeah, I was taking up the Nordics.
Yep.
Yeah. That's good to see we're starting the year as we mean to go on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But when I heard that Dominic Cummings had been in to see Rishi Sunak,
yes.
And I thought, oh, wow, what an extraordinary thing for Sunak to have done, and to hope that it would stay quiet, private. It just underlines that sense of him wavering all over the place. We had the party conference last October when he was talking about, we're going to break with the past, I am the future. And then he brings David Cameron back into the cabinet. And you think, oh, well, that strategy's obviously been wrapped up. And their playbook is unclear.
Yeah, it is. And I think that you can understand why Sunak might be tempted by someone like Cummings. Look, I mean, Cummings in many ways is a pretty odious character. He is, though, for all of those faults and personal faults, pretty clear-sighted and has, whatever you think about him and his politics, and has had clear strategic sense. So you can understand someone like Sunak, who seems so often to lack any of that, and the people around him to lack any of that, why he might find someone like Cummings appealing. Cummings has always found him pretty appealing, it has to be said, in the sense that, Cummings has repeatedly said that Sunak is like the smartest MP, one of the smartest, probably the smartest Prime Minister there's ever been. Cummings is often impressed by that sort of intellect that perhaps Sunak has. So, it's not surprising to me that they might be having conversations. But if Sunak is going to go down that road, he might as well just do it. Because, to go back to the question of reform for a moment, it is clear to me that one of the biggest dangers of reform is that their presence, more than it being an electoral problem, is that they end up, in terms of their arguments, dragging Sunak into a place where probably he doesn't want to go. So if we just look at what reform we're saying today, so there are pledges that they announced today. They said, make work pay, lift income tax to 20,000, currently at 12,500. Cut wasteful government spending, say £5 in every 100. Freeze non-essential immigration, one in, one out. Scrap job-destroying multi-trillion-pound burden of net zero, right? Now, Tice and Reform can say that all they like. This is the great gift of the populace, right? They don't have to worry about ever implementing any of this stuff. They don't have to ever think about, actually the profound consequences of some of those policies, like having one in, one out, and all of those sort of things, and the damage that could have to the British economy, and how unwieldy it would be, and what it would happen in terms of investment if we scrapped all net zero investment, what it would do to Britain's place in these markets. They don't have to think about that. Sunak does. The Conservatives do. And so the danger, though, is that if the more of these arguments get traction, and my word, will there be more traction from them from some parts of the Conservative press, and the pressure on Sunak accordingly, that again, he just finds himself being buffeted around. So at least with someone like Cummings, or whoever it is, whatever strategy they choose to put in place, they have to find it, and they have to stick to it, and have the vision and the necessary political imperative to actually see a message through, which is something that they singularly failed to do for the whole of 2023.
Okay, so let's go to the Labour side of this, because it is possible that there will be a May general election. Mm-hmm. As you say, probably not, but it could be. How ready is the Labour Party? How ready is Keir Starmer to fight a general election? Because it seems to me, in broad themes, Labour are pretty clear about what they would like to do, but their feet haven't been held to the flame over what they're going to do about immigration. I mean, I know that we've heard about the 5 principles that Yvette Cooper has got. We've heard about what they're going to do about kind of energy and green energy and this £28 billion. Is that going to still stand? Is that going to be one of those policies that has to be discarded before an election? And maybe Ed Miliband with it as well? Who knows? There are all sorts of things where it seems to me that Labour are still some distance from having all their ducks in a row.
Well, again, it's that difference, isn't it, John, between the psychology of an election next year, however close next year is, and an election this year. There will be a difference. I'm sure, I think they're prepared for this, but there will be a difference for Labour shadow frontbenchers going onto the airwaves, coming onto shows like ours and elsewhere as well, in terms of how they are treated by interviewers, by the media, and by the public as well, because this could be their mess in 3 months, in 6 months, in 9 months. And suddenly what the Labour Party thinks is no longer academic. It is actually has consequence and purpose for the rest of the country. And, they will start in very short order to be receiving their briefings with senior civil servants that opposition parties receive in the run-up to a general election. It is all going to start feeling far more real for them. And you're right, there are questions that are currently unanswered in a whole ream of different policy areas, which, if they don't have good answers to those things, for example, like on the 28 billion, what's it going to be spent on a year? What difference is it going to make? What's it going to realise? They will find themselves very quickly thrown off course and looking shaky and looking unready. And that is potentially a kind of narrative political hook which the Conservatives and which Sunak can sort of latch onto and at least have something to say about them, even if they don't have much to say about themselves.
I was interested that Morgan McSweeney, the sort of chief election strategist for the Labour Party, apparently did a presentation to the shadow cabinet just before Christmas, warning them that you may have a 20-point lead now, but things can turn very quickly, and used evidence from around the world. And I was with one of the people who's kind of involved in planning the general election just before Christmas, who was emphasising that point, saying, the lead is great, fabulous, but it can disappear in a second, and that the Labour Party cannot take its foot off the gas, have room for any complacency whatsoever. And I just kind of wonder, and Sue Gray is now sort of chief of staff, the former person from the cabinet office, who is in there trying to make sure that everything is kind of, all tied down, and that it's waterproof and it's shockproof and it's bomb-proof to attacks in the general election campaign. And just the impression I get from speaking to people is that they are not there yet. There's still a lot of work to do.
I think that a lot of the people around Starmer know that there is a long way to go in policy terms, and there is some fear about that being exposed and fear about kind of where that goes. There is one other really interesting dynamic, though, just in terms of the timing of the election and how it affects both Labour and Tories, which is not even our election, which is the US election. Because that, of course, is going to run the cycle for that effectively, particularly if our election comes in October, November. The cycle is basically going to be very, very similar, which has not happened since, we haven't had an election in the same year as the US since 92, haven't had one in the same kind of like month or so period since 1964. So this is an unusual kind of dynamic. And normally I think it wouldn't matter that much. The one way in which it might matter more this time is, of course, Trump, assuming that he's the Republican nominee. Because if he is the Republican nominee and looks like he might win, which of course there is a perfectly substantial chance of him so doing, then again, it slightly sort of affects the dynamics in terms of reform. The fact that they will make enormous play of it. They will say that, like Trump, that this is a time of sort of insurgents and of populists and of people taking on the establishment. We're just like him. You can imagine Farage will turn up campaigning with Trump. He'll be campaigning with Tice. They'll say, as we heard today, Tice make the argument that they are both socialists. Sunak is a socialist, must be news to him and the rest of us, and Starmer is a socialist. He's talking about Starmageddon, trying to emulate those kind of Trump-type tactics. It will be a kind of weird kind of dynamic of our campaign, and of course it'll be questions for Starmer as well, and the Labour front bench, who previously have been pretty unkind words to say about Trump.
How much are you looking forward to working with President Trump again, Mr. Starmer?
What's Trump's name for Keir going to be?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh dear, Keir.
Oh dear, Keir.
Oh no.
Yeah, but
Warren Keir.
But that is why you would think that actually it's uncomfortable for both sides. And that, I don't buy the argument that for national security reasons, you can't have an election at the same time in the US.
This has been a suggestion that's been running for a few months.
Yeah, so national security people are saying, oh, this is too risky with election interference from Russia. You can't have two elections running concurrently. I don't buy that.
There's arguments about Five Eyes and security.
Exactly.
But I don't think you'd want them on the same day or the same week just for... think of the journalists. Will someone please think of the journalists?
For people like me, I need sleep and I want to cover the US election and the UK election. It's just not fair on the news agents.
And you've got to get your holidays in as well.
Oh, don't start. Just back from Norway, just back from Iceland.
It was Christmas.
Give it a rest.
It was Christmas. It was a normal holiday for people.
Right, we're going to carry on arguing. We'll be back in a second.
So we've been away for Christmas, as we were just saying, John.
No, I stayed in London. I was here ready for work in London. You were away for Christmas.
Yeah, right. We need to get this straight, right? When the show's off, that's when you can go away. When the show's not on, you shouldn't go away. So we were off obviously over Christmas, but the news didn't stop over Christmas. It was actually reasonably busy, and we just thought that we would just catch up with a few of the stories that have been caught our eye while we were off air. And of course, we can't really start anywhere else other than with the much deserved honours, I think, the much deserved honours of the freedom fighters, the fighters for independence and conservative principles that were honoured by our former Prime Minister, the dearly beloved, politically late Mary Elizabeth Truss, who, as Prime Minister, had a resignation on his list because, she was there 49 days, but she still gets the list, and indeed has chosen to give several honours and indeed places in the legislature to friends, aides of hers, people that she described as great doughty champions of freedom.
In Global, when we take on a new member of staff, they go through this whole period where they are on probation. And after 90 days, if things have gone well, they'll get a full-time job. With Liz Truss, you do 49 days and you become Lord or Lady somebody or other. You get an OBE after your name. It's just unbelievable.
So I saw
people in normal walks of life.
So because you were at home and bored, obviously, I saw you tweeting a lot over Christmas about spiders and other things, and I did see that you got a bit annoyed about all this over on Twitter. I saw it took Twitter by storm.
It was just one of those things that I have been to Buckingham Palace for an honours, and my mother got an MBE. She'd worked as a social worker.
You were about to tell us you were knighted.
No, I've got nothing. I'm never going to get anything. I'm never getting anything. And I thought it was absolutely magnificent that all these people who had served their communities for 30, 40 years or whatever, had been lollipop ladies, had worked in the schools, had helped out in the prisons, had helped, all that sort. And they get an OBE, and it's fabulous. And you see the Queen pinning the medal on my mother was just a kind of beautiful moment.
It meant a lot to her, I'm sure.
Yeah, it did. And it's one of those things where I do support the honours system. But to see it undermined because someone who was Prime Minister for 49 days in the most disastrous period of British history that has saddled people with higher mortgages, it makes my blood boil. And I just thought this is absurd. I also thought...
You had a nice relaxing Christmas then.
Yeah, I also thought sneaking it out with the normal honours when MPs are away in the hope that you could just slip this under the rug without anybody noticing that it's happening, I also thought was cheap. And I just think, you know what? Those people, I don't begrudge. I don't know John Moynihan who's going to get a peerage. I don't know Ruth Porter, party donor. I don't know Ruth Porter. I don't know Matthew Elliott. Well, I do know Matthew Elliott a bit, who was the CEO of Vote Leave. Yeah. They are going to get peerages. for it. I wonder when they are at Buckingham Palace or wherever the investiture takes place,
The
whether
Lords
they
itself,
are
I think.
whether they are going to feel the same sense of pride as all those other people who've worked for decades in their local community, and they did 49 days under Liz Truss.
Well, I'm sure that the touch of ermine will make them feel better, no matter what.
It will take away the saltiness of the tears, I'm sure, once they've got the ermine draped round their shoulders. But honestly, really, the whole resignation honours thing is just get rid of it.
And we should say, like, not all prime ministers even do it.
No.
Blair didn't do it. Okay, there'd been the Cash for Honours scandal, so perhaps he felt like he couldn't. Brown didn't do it. Ted Heath didn't do it. I don't think Douglas Hume did it. You know, it's something that is up to the discretion of an individual prime minister, and you would hope that individual prime ministers would use that discretion appropriately. You know what? Maybe we're at the point, I was thinking about this over Christmas, that maybe it's almost too much to ask for a prime minister to sort of exercise that kind of restraint. Like, maybe like when you're in that position and you've got to that point and you've got all these people around you who, you know, I mean, not really, I suppose not in Truss's case because she hadn't been there for that long, but, you know, often who work for prime minister, you know, they spill blood, sweat and tears for you. They don't really get much acclaim or much kind of much reward for it by comparison to the prime minister stuff. Maybe you feel a bit of guilt. Maybe you think, I need to give them something to recognise, see how hard you've worked. Maybe and maybe that's a perfectly human instinct, which is precisely why a prime minister shouldn't be in a position to do it. Because the whole point of a system, it should just be completely taken out of an individual politician's hands, put into the hands of a committee, just like appointments to the House of Lords.
Totally.
And then if someone does get an appointment, if someone does get a place in the Lords, they can do so without the taint, without the stench of corruption. Because corruption is what it is. If you have given £700,000 to party funds and you just happen to end up in the House of Lords, like most of the treasurers of the Conservative Party have curiously enough ended up in the House of Lords, that just has the stink of foul play and corruption about it, whatever the ins and outs and facts of the case.
I also think there is something about the shamelessness of it. That here you've had the most disastrous premiership that has barely lasted a few weeks, that an iceberg lettuce memorably lasted longer for. And yet you're doling out honours to those people who have served.
I mean, she is
you.
shameless. I mean, she's completely shameless.
But it is, you go back to the sort of, the Profumo affair, and John Profumo, after his downfall in the 1960s, devotes his work to this kind of settlement in the East End of London, and works at Toynbee Hall for year after year after year. You get Lord Carrington, who resigns because he feels he didn't see that the invasion of the Falkland Islands was coming, and there was sort of principle and there was decency involved. And I do think there has been a corrosion of what is acceptable in public life, and that you've learnt from Donald Trump, you just ride anything out, you never apologise, never explain, and you just take whatever is coming your way.
And you blame everyone else, which is exactly what Truss has done from the very beginning. I mean, she is extraordinary. Talking of ermine, Baroness Mone.
Baroness Mone, before Christmas, gave what I thought was an extraordinarily ill-judged interview to Laura Kuenssberg, and kind of essentially sets out the case for the prosecution. If there is going to be a prosecution, there's an investigation underway by the National Crime Agency, but no charges. But they are coming out all guns blazing and saying they are the victims in all of this. And I kind of think on one hand, oh, come off it, love. You're not a bloody victim. You're a multi-squillionaire, and you've got all this money from the dodgy PPE contract and from the gowns that didn't fit and, all the rest of it. But I just do wonder whether there is a grain of truth that they are being held up as the poster children for the excess of the PPE contracts, and there were all sorts of other people who benefited richly, and those decisions were overseen by people in government who are still there today, and whether there is a point that Michelle Mone and Mr. Barrowman have about some of what they're saying.
So I think there are 2 points about the PPE and the PPE kind of scandals and Mone specifically. One is, I have to say, I do have some sympathy, not with Mone and with the two of them, and with some of the particularly kind of clearly suspect things that went on in that time. There is a general thing now which I think is forgotten during the heart of the pandemic, because I covered this very, very closely when I was at Newsnight. I did loads and loads of stories about PPE and terrible PPE and nurses and care workers, wearing kind of skiing goggles and all sorts of like awful things. I think people do slightly forget the absolute terror that there was at that moment, that basically we didn't have enough PPE, which itself was actually a big failure of government planning and something that had been pointed out again and again, and the stockpiles were running low. And there was an imperative, partly driven by people like me in the media, doing story after story, pointing to care home after care home, hospital after hospital, hospice after hospice, of nurses and doctors going in wearing the most appallingly threadbare, literally, items. And I mean, I spoke to civil servants and ministers at the time, basically, and they said, we are throwing all the stops at this. We'll take it wherever we can get it. And indeed, there were lots of criticisms from Labour MPs at the time. I remember speaking to them as well, phoning me up and going, I'm trying to talk to a minister. I can arrange, 10,000 gowns with this factory in my constituency. I can arrange 50,000 masks for this factory in my constituency. I can't get through. And I do kind of think you can't quite have it both ways. Either the government wasn't responsive enough at the time, or it should have been even more responsive, or the rules were too lax. I don't think you can kind of have both, which I think some of the critics have. That said, I do think that the element of the Moan interview I found most astounding, and this talks to your previous point, John, about standards in public life, was that moment that she said to Laura Kuenssberg, "Oh, Laura, all we did was just lie to journalists. It's not a crime. You are a member of the House of Lords. You are a peer of this country, a member of the legislature for life. And you are saying there's nothing wrong with just lying to people, to journalists asking legitimate questions about your business interests and your connections with political ministers?" What? The very fact that she and he sat there with a straight face and felt able to say that, I think spoke to something that is completely rotten in our politics.
One other big change, the Queen of Denmark. I think 52 years on the throne.
Friend of yours?
Not met yet.
No? It's unfortunate.
Well, I'm sure she'll invite me to a lunch very soon.
I'm sure. It's pretty much the only Nordic country I was in over the Christmas holidays, and there was some news, and unfortunately I wasn't quite there, so missed it again.
Story one more time.
Once again. Yeah. Queen Margaret II abdicated. 52 years. Long time.
It's a very long time. And Frederick...
You probably covered her coronation, didn't you?
Oh, get lost.
And she's going to be succeeded by Frederick X. Frederick X. Frederick, formerly known as Twitter.
Oh, yeah, Frederick X. And you kind of then had to correct that, didn't you? And said,
it wasn't a kiss when I tweeted. Yeah.
Because you thought the X was a kiss.
I know. People do that all the time. It's because I'm such a friendly person.
You're such a lovey.
I'm such a lovey. I'm so nice.
Yeah, little heart emojis on all the messages you send me.
We're going to be back just after this, where we're going to be talking about John body-shaming a darts player who's 16. Right, before we go, the nation has been gripped by darts in the last couple of days. This is the other thing that we've missed, and in particular the extraordinary journey of young Luke Littler, who is 16 and
Luke the
Nuke, who is now that's very Trump. Luke the Nuke, love the darts, so good, great arrows, and who's extraordinarily got into the World Darts Final.
Yeah,
is it? Yeah. And I have to say, John, 2024 on my list of sort of surprising stories, it didn't actually have on it you body-shaming a 16-year-old darts player, because you tweeted yesterday, I think Tom Cruise should play him in the movie. He looks 25 years younger than he is, and Luke Littler looks 25 years older. Should be nicely imbalanced then. Tom might have to bulk up a bit. What was the thought process behind that tweet, John?
Just that Tom Cruise is very slight, and... like a lot of darts players, where the body shape ideally seems to be a little more round.
Yeah, we're going to get cancelled. We're only 2-3 days in. This is our first show back. Lady Maitlis has been gone.
It was meant to be just a little light-hearted
a little joke.
A light-hearted aside.
Are you a darts fan?
I'm going to be watching tonight.
Well, you've got it now. You're going to have to send an apology.
I'm going to be cheering.
Farage last year, Luke Littler this year. What's next?
We'll be back tomorrow to find out.
Probably.
Bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.